I'm Lorna Rozelle, and thank you for inviting us here and for the nice introduction. Well, what I'm going to do is talk about American Sign Language from a linguistic point of view. So it's kind of more technical, maybe, this first part. I'm going to say, what is a language? What is a signed language? I'm going to talk about some facts about signed languages, some grammatical aspects of ASL, and I'm going to focus on one thread that's going to run through this whole talk. So keep in mind the idea of something that's happening simultaneously versus something that's happening sequentially. So keep an eye out for those terms because they'll keep coming up. And I'm going to talk about why this is important to sign languages and to us as human beings, basically. It'll be the big picture point. Okay, so what is language? Language is the coolest possible thing that a person could study. It's an essential part of us. It's part of what it means to be human. It connects us to each other from the moment we're born. Someone will talk to us. Someone will sign to us. They'll say what a beautiful baby we are. It's how we say Happy Mother's Day to our mothers, right? It connects us to our origins. It's part of our identity. It gives us access to information, to culture, to the past, to other people's minds, to other places. And as human beings, we really, really deeply, deeply desire and crave a language. It's imperative for us to have a language. It's how we got to where we are, both as an individual, personally, and as a species. Part of the reason we are so successful on planet Earth is due to language. Okay, language is part of our bodies. It's in our brains. It's encoded and structured by our brains, and it's a basic human right. Okay. So what is linguistics? Linguistics is a study of the entire phenomena of language. All right. So it's not. Some people think linguists, oh, that's a person who studies a lot of languages, and it might be, but the point isn't studying a lot of languages, it's understanding language. And languages are extremely diverse. They're very different. They're extraordinarily complex. They're really intricate and beautiful, and they're very controversial. So there's always arguments about language, both, amongst linguists, they always argue about linguistics, but it's very controversial even in the general public. So it's exciting to study linguistics. So here are some fundamental questions in linguistics. I'm not going to go over these, but just give you an idea. The field is very broad. How do we use language to talk to one another? How do babies learn language? What does it mean to know a language? If you know a language, what do you know? What happens if we never, ever learn a language? How is language represented in our brains? How are languages alike? How are they different? How are languages born? Okay? And key to answering all of these questions is sign language. So once linguists started looking at sign languages, which didn't happen nearly as quickly as it ought to have happened, but once people start looking at sign languages, linguists realize the sign language holds the key to a lot of answers to these questions. So, okay, what are sign languages? The short answer is they're languages, okay? So it's not like, oh, well, sign languages are superior, or sorry, spoken languages are superior, they're up here, and then sign languages, they're languages, but they're down here. No, they're languages. As far as linguists are concerned, they're languages. They are languages in a different modality, and that word is important, so I put it in red. Modality is a way of saying how the language is expressed. So sign languages are called visual gestural. Spoken languages are oral. So Sign languages are perceived with the eyes, and they're produced with the hands, the face, the body. Spoken languages are perceived with the ear, and they're produced with the mouth and the vocal tract. Okay, so that's what modality is. So obviously, this is a big difference, clearly, but it has implications that are not very obvious, which is really interesting. So I'm going to hopefully get to that. So sign languages are languages that are complex. They have complicated, complex, rich, nuanced grammars. They have everything you need in a language. They are expressive. You could talk about anything you want in a sign language, express any thought you have. Sign languages are not universal. So there are hundreds of different sign languages. We don't know how many, maybe 300 more, most of which we haven't documented, we don't know much about. Maybe 70 million deaf people use sign language as their first language around the world. These languages can be old languages, like French Sign Language, or Adamarobe Sign Language, which is in Ghana, or Hawaiian Sign Language. Or they could be young languages, like Israeli Sign Language, El Said Bedouin Sign Language, Nicaraguan Sign Language. These sign languages are less than 100 years old. And new sign languages are discovered all the time. They're new. They're not new. Someone just discovered there was a sign language in Hawaii a few years ago. We didn't realize that. It's different than American Sign Language. We didn't know that sign language existed before. So new ones are being discovered all the time. Sign languages are not parasitic on spoken language. So the grammar of ASL is independent of the grammar of English. So, for example, among many differences, there's different word order. ASL has a more complex verb structure than English does, so the verbs are more like the verbs in Navajo. ASL has no articles. For example, the words the and that we have in English, ASL doesn't have words like that. So in that respect, ASL is like spoken Chinese or spoken Finnish. There's no verb to be in ASL, which is a surprise to someone who speaks English, right? How can you not have the verb to be? Well, spoken Japanese, Russian, they don't have the verb to be either. So these are just some examples of differences between the languages. And a fun fact is that British Sign Language and American Sign Language are distinct languages. They're historically unrelated and they're mutually unintelligible. So, if the sign language was somehow dependent on the grammar of the spoken language, you would expect them to be the same, but they're not. So sign languages are natural languages. They're spontaneously occurring. That means they weren't invented. It's not like somebody was, oh, why don't I invent a sign language? That's not what happened. They just arose naturally, and they were born naturally, and they evolved naturally. So sign languages develop and grow wherever there's a critical mass of people who want to talk to each other. So like I said, language is this deep need in people. So whenever you get a bunch of people together, they want to talk to each other. So if you get enough deaf people together, they want to talk to each other, they will develop a sign language. So these deaf people developing the sign language, they create this unique linguistic and cultural community that's vibrant, it's diverse, it has its own history, its own art, its own literature, institutions, values, social norms, and in particular for us right now, language. Okay. So let me take a moment to just say something about iconicity. So what does that mean? Well, have you ever tried to communicate with someone that you didn't share a language with? Maybe if you know ASL, maybe you can sign with somebody, another deaf person. If you're a hearing person, you have a spoken language, it's a lot harder. So you might gesture, or you might draw pictures. So I had a friend from Afghanistan, and his wife came, and she didn't speak any English, and we wanted to talk about cooking. And so I ended up like drawing a picture of grapes, drawing a picture of the sun, and then drawing a picture of little black things. And I got the point of raisins across, right? But, you know, it was hard. So drawings and gestures are called iconic symbols. They look like what they stand for, and they can be understood, more or less, without language. Now, sign languages use a lot of iconicity, okay? So there are different signs that look like what they mean. These signs are iconic, but they're still complicated. There's still rules that govern them. There's still a lot to be said about them. And there's more than just iconicity. So I just recently had a friend who doesn't know anything about sign language, and he was like, so, you know, everything looks like it's referent, right? Everything is iconic, isn't it? I'm like, well, no, actually. Let's back up and talk a little more. And the reason that there's more than just iconicity, you know, it's an important part of sign languages, but there's more because people want to talk, and they want to talk about complicated things. Language is complicated. And here's some examples of complication in English. So in English, for example, we could use only little everyday words and say pretty complex things. So, for example, if you come at 7, the game will have been being played for an hour already. Will have been being played. That's a whole bunch of stuff together that says something pretty complicated about the timing of the events. Or the next sentence, all the sorrow he had had no effect on his happiness. Had. But, you know, reading it is weird. But it's the sort of thing people say all the time. It's totally understandable. But it's complicated. The next group of examples is kind of funny. This is called wanna contraction because it's contracting want and to into wanna. So for example, this is the piano I want to play. Is a good sentence. This is the pianist I want to play is a bad sentence. So if you're a native speaker of English, it's like, oh, that's weird. You don't say it that way. You could say wanta, but you can't say wanna. This is the man I want to kill. Bad sentiment, but it's a good sentence, right? This is the man I want to kill. That's good English. This is the man I want to die. Doesn't work. It sounds like, you know, you have someone and you're sticking him in a pot of blue dye, right? This is the man I want to die. Doesn't work. I can guarantee, okay, so this is robustly true. English speakers agree on this data, right? It's not just my opinion. But I can guarantee that none of us had an 8th grade English teacher teach us when you could say wanna and when you can't say wanna. Okay? We just know it because we know English. When I said, what do you know? What do we know when we know a language? Well, this is one of the things we know when we know English. And it's weird and it's complicated. So in order to convey these more complicated meanings, we need rules. And that's what grammar does for us. Okay, these aren't the kind of rules you might have learned in 8th grade, like don't end a sentence with a preposition. These are like more analogous to like natural laws, like the law of gravity. We don't even think about it, and we can't even imagine breaking this rule. So sign languages clearly convey very complex information, so they must have a complex grammar. Where does this grammar come from? Does it come from English? No. I've already said it doesn't come from English. maybe ASL and English grammars have the same basic like underlying skeleton, because all human languages will have the same basic skeleton. But otherwise they're very different languages. So for example, there's a way to like kind of quantify, if you know English, how hard is it for you to be learning some other language? Okay, and so learning ASL is very hard if your native language is English. It's as hard as, say, learning something, you know, a spoken language like Chinese or Arabic or Finnish, some very different language. This might seem a little bit surprising because, you know, people might say, well, I took a year of ASL and now I can talk to deaf people, which is true. But that's not because you've like learned all of ASL. It's because deaf people are really great communicators. They're very flexible and they're very skillful. So they will meet you more than halfway. But basically, learning ASL is hard because it's an extremely different language from English. Okay, so not going to talk about all this. I said there's a skeleton. Well, this is part of what I mean by that. There are levels of linguistic structure. So there's a lot of words here. I'm not going to look at all this. I'm going to look a little bit at these two technical bits of linguistics, phonology and morphology. Okay? So phonology is looking at the little pieces that go into creating a word. So a spoken word is made up out of sounds. So if we have a word like bat, that's made out of 3 sounds, b, a, t. Okay? So, and notice they come sequentially, the b, the a, and the t. So when we break apart a word into the little pieces that we use to form it, we get these sounds, and they come one after another. Notice that the words bat and pat have different meanings. Bat and pat differ only a tiny bit when you say them. Okay, the only difference is in the beginning of the word, that B versus P. The only difference is whether your vocal cords are vibrating when you say that word. So when you say bat, your vocal cords are vibrating at the beginning. When you say pat, they're not. So this is kind of weird when you start thinking about it. The vibration of your vocal cords signals a difference in meaning. So, you know, you can let that sink in for a moment. So we say that voicing, whether your vocal cords are vibrating or not, is distinctive or contrastive in English. It's important in understanding English to pay attention to the vibration of the vocal cords or to make your vocal cords vibrate. It means different things. What about sign language? Well, in sign language, the formational elements that we're going to look at are formational elements of signs. So you take a word apart, you get sounds. You take a sign apart, you get hand shape, location, movement, orientation, and possibly non-manual expressions, which are very important in other aspects of the grammar, but I won't be focusing on it here. So hand shape, for example, I'm going to show some minimal pairs. So minimal pairs mean they're almost exactly the same, but not quite. Okay, so apple versus candy. Okay, so this is apple, this is candy. Apple, candy. So the only difference is the hand shape. So candy has this hand shape with my finger extended. Apple has this. They're both made in the same spot. So location is the same and the movement is the same, that twisting movement. So that's called a minimal pair. They differ only in hand shape. Location. This is a sign for apple. So this means apple. This means onion. So same hand shape, same movement, but the location is different. But obviously, apples and onions are different. So in ASL, you have to pay attention to where the sign is made. Movement. There is sign name with this movement and the sign soon with this movement. Otherwise, The signs are identical. Finally, orientation. This is a sign name. This is a sign share. Everything is the same. The hand shapes are the same. They're both made in the same place. They have the same kind of movement, but the orientation of my hands is different. So in English, one of the things we have to pay attention to is the vibration of the vocal cords. Sign language, you pay attention to different things. Small changes in these parameters make signs that mean different things. Okay, so that's what I mean by the phonology of a sign language. Okay. Now, in spoken language, every word can be broken down into its components, which are sounds, and these sounds are transmitted sequentially. In sign language, every sign can be broken down into its components, which are hand shape, location, movement, orientation, and these parameters are transmitted simultaneously. Did I just say the same thing? Okay, sorry. Spoken language, they come at you sequentially, like at. In sign language, you got this hand shape, this location, and this movement. They're all happening at the same time. So you got this little bundle of information, and it's being transmitted to you simultaneously as one chunk. So this is like the difference between, like, you know, if I have a bag of potato chips, I could feed you a potato chip one by one, which is kind of how things come at you in spoken language, or I could take the whole package of potato chips and just hand it to you. Okay? So that's the idea with this sequential versus simultaneous thing. So this is an analysis of a sign, which is a really big deal for linguists, at least. Okay, so this is what I just said. Interesting difference. Spoken language phonology is mostly sequential. Sign language phonology is mostly simultaneous. Okay, let's move on to morphology. So I said there are these different levels of linguistic structure, phonology. Now, looking at morphology. A morpheme is the smallest unit of language that has a meaning. So in English, for example, we have a word like unreadable. So read is the verb there. We could put a bull on it, or we could put the prefix un. So unreadable, meaning not able to be read, right? So notice those morphemes come one after another, unreadable. We have beaded with the ed as a past tense morpheme. We have, you know, the famous word anti-disestablishmentarianisms with a whole ton of morphemes in there, right? You know, theoretically possible. And all those morphemes come one after another. So, you know, English, we could put some morphemes together. Navajo is a spoken language. It's called polysynthetic, which means one word can contain a whole lot of morphemes, a lot more than in English. Okay? So this one word, which I cannot pronounce, I'm afraid, means I am starting to drive some kind of wheeled vehicle along. So it's called a verb-centric language, Navajo, because you can put so much information, so much meaning, so many morphemes in a one word. ASL is polysynthetic too. It has lots of morphology, lots more than English has. Signs are often very morphologically complex. Possibly up to, say, 7 multi-layered morphemes, and that's Lance's word, multi-layered morphemes occurring simultaneously. So an example is, did I carelessly give a thick thing to you repeatedly? So, I'll sign it, yeah, sure. So yes. Okay, so the question part comes with a non-manual expression involving, among other things, the eyebrows, the tongue, my mouth morpheme was signaling carelessly. The thick thing was the hand shape. I giving to you goes from this position to that position, so that's from one location to another. This is the verb to give, and then that repeated circular motion gives you that repeatedly meaning. So there are 7 meanings in that one verb, that one sign. So it's very much like what we've seen in Navajo. Okay, I have a great example in Finnish too, but you can ask me later. So notice these 7 morphemes are all signed simultaneously. Okay. All right, so another example in morphology are noun-verb pairs. I'm going to go over this kind of quick. So ASL, as you might know, has a distinction between related nouns and verbs. So for example, airplane is signed this way with a small repeated movement, but fly is signed with one smooth movement. Chair, the noun, is signed with a repeated movement. Sit is signed with one smooth movement. Okay, so no, the hand shapes are the same, that sort of thing, but the movement, whether it's a small repeated movement or a big smooth movement, signals whether it's a noun or a verb. So a linguistic detail is given morphologically like that. Okay, and notice again, these morphemes are occurring simultaneously in sign language. Non-manual adverbs, I mentioned this with carelessly. So say 2 of these non-manual adverbs that ASL has, there's a lot of them, but one of them is called, noted MM. And the other is noted TH, and I can sign them for you. MM means normally with relaxed enjoyment, and the TH means carelessly. So I can sign, I drive normally, like this, or I drive carelessly, like this. Notice that mouth morpheme is occurring simultaneously with the part of the hands, the driving part. Okay, so more evidence of like the complicated morphology that ASL has. Okay, so what I was trying to show here is that in all levels of linguistic structure, I talked about phonology and morphology, but it's true of all the levels of linguistic structure, syntax, discourse, and so on, lots and lots of examples, where a speaker hands out information 1 bit at a time. So sequentially, a signer bundles up a whole bunch of information and hands it to you at the same time. Okay? Simplified version, but it's basically true, and there's lots of other examples that we don't have time to do. Isn't this fascinating? Like, this is so cool. Like I said, obviously the modality, remember modality means, are you doing it with your, your hands and your face and your body, and you're perceiving with your ears, with your eyes, or are you using your vocal tract to produce sounds and then perceiving with your ears? That's the modality. So here seems to be a modality difference. Where does it come from? Why? Well, I have something to say about that. This is almost the end. The articulators of the vocal tract are small. So our vocal cords, our tongue, these are relatively small articulators, and they can move very fast. Our vocal cords can vibrate very quickly. Our tongue can move really fast. So we could produce lots of different sounds, one after the other, really quickly. And we can perceive it because our ears are good at perceiving rapidly changing auditory input. On the other hand, the articulators of the hands, the arms, the bodies are bigger and they are slower. They move more slowly than the articulators in the vocal tract. However, However, we all have the same brains. Whether we are signing or we are speaking, our brain is the same. The brains are all the same. And our brains like to receive information at a certain rate. If it's too fast, if we're getting information too fast, we get confused. If it's too slow, we get bored. Okay, so this is found to be true cross-linguistically across spoken languages. People like languages transmit information at a certain pace. So you can count it in numbers of morphemes per minute or something, right? So there's a way to figure out how much information is transferred, and it's about the same for all languages, all spoken languages. Interestingly, it's the same for spoken or sign languages too, you know, because our brains want to get information at a certain pace. It's the same also for signed languages. How can it be if our mouth is faster than our hands? How can we get information just at the same speed? Well, it's because in spoken language, the information comes at us one piece at a time in spoken language. But in sign language, we get these whole chunks, these whole multi-layered bundles of information handed to us all at once, which is fast. So having this distinction between simultaneity and sequentiality is a result of the different modality of the language. And this shows how our brains love language. We want, like I said, we want language. If we're with people, we want to talk to them. If we don't have a language, we will create one. We will create a language out of whatever resources we have. If we're hearing, maybe we'll use our vocal tract and our ears for language. If we're deaf, we will use our hands, our bodies, and our eyes for language. We create it out of whatever resources we have, and what's more, the language we create is perfect. It's perfectly tailored to our brains. It's tailored to our brains so that we get information at the right pace. And it's tailored to our resources, whether they're, where we have visual resources and we're using our hands and our face and our bodies, or we are using our ears and our vocal tract. The language will be perfect for that modality, and it'll be perfectly suited to our brains because our brains want information at a certain rate, and it will allow us to communicate, which, as I said in the first slide, we really, really, really want to talk to people. So, okay, I hope I didn't go over too much. Thank you.